If you want to master your energy, if you want to rise above manipulation, chaos, and emotional volatility, the first and perhaps most profound thing you must do is become aware of where your energy is going. Because where your attention goes, your life follows. And the tragedy for so many people, especially intelligent, empathetic individuals, is that their energy is constantly being siphoned off by people and systems that are fundamentally misaligned with their well-being. Now think about that for a moment. If someone or something can consistently provoke you, distract you, or hook your emotions, then that force is governing your internal reality, not you. You can claim to be in control. You can say you're resilient or wise. But if you're constantly reacting out of anxiety, resentment, guilt, obligation, you're not actually choosing. You're being driven. This is precisely how narcissists operate. Not just in intimate relationships, but in work environments, institutions, even in cultural and digital spaces. Narcissists are energetic parasites. They can't self-sustain emotionally, so they provoke, they incite, they bait, and your attention is the meal. They don't care if it's positive or negative, adoring or enraged. They just need you to care. And once you do, they've got you. You're no longer centered in your own frame of reality or orbiting theirs. And that, psychologically, is a form of servitude. But here's the thing. Most people don't realize it's happening because they've never been taught to consciously track their energy. You ask them, what did you give your energy to today? And they'll rattle off a to-do list. But that's not the real question. The real question is, what occupied your attention? What provoked your nervous system? Who pulled you out of peace? And did they deserve that power over you? When you start to notice that your mental bandwidth is being drained by arguments in your head, by imaginary confrontations with people you haven't seen in years, by doom-scrolling social media and analyzing passive-aggressive text messages, what you're seeing is an unconscious energy leak. And when your energy is leaking, your sense of self begins to fragment. You become more reactive, more unstable, less focused, and more emotionally vulnerable to being hijacked. And that is when you are easiest to manipulate. So the first step is radical awareness. You need to become a student of your own energy. That means paying attention. Not in a judgmental way, but in a precise, curious way. Who do you feel drained around? Who activates that subtle pressure in your chest, that unspoken anxiety in your gut? What situations make you feel like you're walking on eggshells? Like your presence is being distorted, your voice muted, your truth dismissed? Those reactions are signals. They are invitations to stop giving blind permission. Because every time you tolerate what drains you, you reinforce the idea that your energy doesn't matter, that you don't matter. And that is a lie, one that's been told often subtly by narcissists and controlling personalities your entire life. Now here's the psychological root of the trap. Many intelligent, sensitive people were raised to feel responsible for other people's emotions, especially women. So when someone gets angry, disappointed, cold, or needy, there's a deep unconscious impulse to fix it, to appease, to explain, to smooth it over. But that compulsion, while socially praised, is exactly what narcissists exploit. They thrive in the presence of people who can't tolerate disapproval. They set the emotional fires and then step back, watching you run around trying to put them out. Meanwhile, they feed on the chaos, on the attention, on your energy. So awareness isn't just some vague spiritual principle. It's a psychological weapon. Because once you see the game, once you truly recognize that someone is manipulating your attention, testing your boundaries, or pulling you into emotional warfare, you have a choice. You can choose to stay in your frame. You can choose to detach, to observe, to redirect. You can choose to stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You can even, and this is the most powerful act, remove your energy entirely. Because nothing frightens a manipulator more than being met with non-reactivity, silence, stillness, indifference. And if you've never tried that, I mean, truly withdrawing your emotional investment from a narcissist, then you have no idea how rattled they become. You'd think you'd slap them across the face. Why? Because your attention was their supply. Your confusion was their leverage. Your anxiety was their control. When you reclaim your awareness, you cut the puppet strings. You begin to move, think, and feel from within instead of constantly being tugged from without. You begin to create space, mental, emotional, spiritual space, where you can actually think clearly, where your intuition returns, where your identity takes root. And from that place, you begin to master your energy, rather than being mastered by the dysfunction around you. So here's the challenge I want to leave you with. Starting today, track your attention like your life depends on it. Because in a very real psychological sense, it does. It does. Reclaim every moment you gave away out of guilt, fear, or habit. Begin to direct your awareness deliberately, not reactively. That shift alone will begin to change the entire trajectory of your life. Own your energy. Guard your attention, because whoever controls your mind controls your reality, and that power is yours to take back. If you want to be untouchable, truly untouchable, you have to master the art of internal stillness. And I don't mean the absence of thought or some kind of Zen detachment that floats above suffering. I mean something far more grounded and far more difficult. I'm talking about the psychological discipline to respond rather than react, to remain composed when the world or a narcissist is begging for your chaos. Let's not be naive about this. Life is confrontation. Not always physical, not always loud, but psychological confrontation is built into the very structure of our social world. And if you don't learn to govern your responses, you will be ruled by external forces. Narcissists, manipulators, volatile personalities, they all operate like emotional engineers. They design moments to pull you in, push your buttons, fracture your peace. And when they succeed, they gain power. Not because they're powerful, but because you surrendered yours in a moment of unconscious reaction. Now here's the kicker. They know this, not intellectually perhaps, but instinctively. Narcissists are finely attuned to the emotional climate in a room. They can sense vulnerability the way a predator senses hesitation. They provoke not because they're confused or clumsy, but because they're testing for control. Every little jab, every subtle insult wrapped in a joke, every carefully timed silence, it's all a psychological probe. And if you flinch, if you fume, if you beg for clarity or defend your honor, they've got you. You're in the game. And now you're playing by their rules. But here's where the shift happens. When you develop the capacity to observe, to witness your own emotional arousal without impulsively reacting, you change the entire dynamic. You become something they didn't anticipate. They expected a dance, and you stood still. They threw bait, and you didn't bite. That silence, that calm refusal to engage, it's not passive, it's potent, it's disarming. Because narcissists don't know what to do with non-reactive strength. They're masters of the emotional game, not the rational one. So when their usual strategies fail, when the drama doesn't erupt, when the emotional payoff doesn't come, they begin to unravel. And let's be clear, I'm not saying never feel anything. You will feel. You should feel. But feeling is not the same as flailing. There is immense power in being able to hold the storm without becoming the storm. That's what real maturity looks like. That's what self-command feels like. It's the difference between being a pawn in someone else's game and becoming the author of your own life. You've probably heard the phrase, don't take it personally. It's become cliche. But if you understand it at a deeper level, it's actually a profound psychological principle. What it really means is, don't let someone else's pathology dictate your state of being. Don't make their projections about you your identity. That's not detachment. That's sovereignty. That's recognizing that you are not obligated to respond to everything that pokes at your nervous system. Some things are beneath your attention. And the more you internalize that, the less reactive you become. You begin to recognize the difference between urgency and importance. Narcissists create urgency. They want everything to be a crisis. They want you on edge. They want you scrambling to explain, to justify, to fix. But when you slow it down, when you say, no, I will not be rushed, I will not be baited, I will not be coerced into emotional labor, you shift the power dynamic. And they hate that. Because in that moment, you're no longer their mirror. You're no longer their emotional vending machine. You're something else entirely. You're free. But that kind of composure doesn't come by accident. It has to be trained. And it's trained in the small, quiet moments, not the big dramatic ones. It's built when you notice your impulse to react and you pause. Eating, you pause. When you breathe through the tension instead of exploding. When you choose silence over sarcasm, dignity over drama, to discipline. And like all disciplines, it requires effort, repetition, and discomfort. But it's worth it. Because the more you practice emotional regulation, the more you begin to trust yourself. And when you trust yourself, you become incredibly difficult to manipulate. That's the paradox. The calmer you are, the more powerful you become. Not because you control others, but because no one else controls you. So here's the invitation. Stop giving your emotional responses away like they cost nothing, because they do cost something. They cost your focus, your integrity, your peace. Learn to sit with the discomfort of not reacting. Let others be wrong about you. Let silence do the talking. Let your restraint speak volumes. Because the moment you stop dancing to the narcissist's rhythm is the moment you reclaim the music of your own life. When you master the pause between stimulus and response, you master yourself. And that's where freedom begins. Let's talk about boundaries. Not as a buzzword, not as some vague idea of a self-care, but as an existential necessity. You can't survive psychologically intact in a chaotic world without clear, firm, consciously articulated boundaries. And you certainly can't survive the psychological warfare of a narcissistic entanglement without them. The boundary isn't a wall. That's not about cutting people off, going cold, or becoming emotionally numb. That's a reaction, not a principle. Boundaries, properly understood, are structures, psychological architectures that protect your inner order from external chaos. They are the rules of engagement for your life, and they're not primarily for other people. They're for you. They're for you. They're the way you assert to yourself, this is what I tolerate, and this is what I do not. This is what is sacred, and this is what is negotiable. This is where I end, and you begin. Now, when you're dealing with a narcissist, boundaries aren't merely advisable. They are essential. Because a narcissist doesn't respect the natural sovereignty of others. In fact, they despise it. Your independence, emotional, intellectual, or spiritual, is a threat to them. Why? Because they require enmeshment to function. They need to blur the lines between their identity and yours. If they can get you to define yourself through their validation or rejection, they've won. You're now a satellite in their orbit, no longer a planet with gravity of your own. And this is where most people get trapped. They think they're maintaining peace by being flexible. They think they're being kind by accommodating one more demand, one more guilt trip, one more subtle insult disguised as concern. What's really happening is erosion. Not externally, but internally. Piece by piece, your psychological structure dissolves. And you don't notice it all at once. It's gradual, insidious. 1,000 small compromises that leave you disoriented, anxious, and unsure of where you went. The antidote to that erosion is the deliberate act of drawing a line, not once, but over and over again. You have to be prepared to defend your inner world like a sovereign territory, and that means becoming uncomfortable. Because a real boundary will cause tension, it will trigger guilt, it will invite pushback, especially from narcissists who interpret your autonomy as defiance, not dignity. But that's the test. If your boundary never upsets anyone, it's probably not a boundary. It's a performance. It's important to understand that narcissists don't necessarily respond to logic. You can explain your reasoning until your voice goes hoarse. You can provide examples, remain calm, be rational, and it still won't work. Because they're not engaging with you on the level of logic. They're playing a game of dominance, of psychological chess. And in that game, your emotional reactivity is their queen. They're trying to move you, not persuade you. So when you set a boundary and you hold it, especially when you hold it without explaining, justifying, or apologizing, you interrupt their game. You signal that their strategies no longer work. That's unsettling to them. And that's exactly what you want, but be warned, this doesn't mean they'll back off gracefully. Often, the opposite happens. They escalate. They test. They accuse. They may become charming, apologetic, or even vulnerable, not out of remorse, but out of strategy. It's a recalibration. They're looking for cracks in your resolve. And the moment you waver, the moment you let guilt or hope override your clarity, they're back in. The cycle resets. This is why boundaries are not a one-time act. They are a posture, a stance you take toward life and toward yourself. And maintaining them requires self-respect. That's the cornerstone. Because if you don't believe you're worthy of respect, you won't demand it. You'll settle for crumbs. You'll confuse being needed with being loved. You'll accept dysfunction as normal and chaos as passion. And in doing so, you abandon yourself. But when you stand firm, when you hold the line, even through discomfort, something profound happens. You begin to recover pieces of yourself that you thought were lost. You stop over-explaining. You stop seeking permission. You stop negotiating your worth, and you start moving differently. You walk into rooms differently. You speak with a kind of grounded authority that doesn't need to shout. People feel it. And narcissists, they recoil from it. Because it's the one thing they cannot manipulate. A person with firm boundaries and a clear sense of self. So if you want to be untouchable, not in the sense of being above pain, but in the sense of being beyond control, start with your boundaries. Make them visible, make them clear, and most of all, make them non-negotiable. Not because you're trying to control others, but because you finally decided to govern yourself. And remember this, silence is a boundary. Distance is a boundary. Saying a no without a 30-minute explanation is a boundary. You don't owe anyone access to you, especially those who have proven themselves unsafe. The moment you hold a boundary, not out of fear, but from principle, that's the moment you begin to reclaim your life. That's the moment you stop surviving and start leading. Let's talk about emotional regulation. Not the bland kind taught in surface-level self-help books, but the kind forged in fire. The kind that emerges when you've walked through chaos and decide, finally, that your nervous system will no longer be a playground for someone else's dysfunction. When you're in the orbit of a narcissist, the very architecture of your emotional reality can become hijacked. They push buttons, not at random, but with precision. They've studied your responses. They know what guilt feels like on your face. They recognize the slight change in your voice when you're anxious. And they use that data the way a predator uses scent. It's not by accident, it's by design. And if they can get you to spiral emotionally, if they can get you to react, then they can control the dynamic. That's the whole game. But here's where the script flips. If you learn how to manage your emotional state, to respond instead of react, you become a moving target they can no longer hit. That's not avoidance, that's strategy. That's the disciplined refusal to hand your internal state over to someone who doesn't care about your well-being. We have to understand this from a deeper psychological perspective. Emotions are ancient messengers. They're not just feelings, they're physiological events tied to survival. When you feel fear, your body prepares to fight or flee. When you feel shame, it often signals a rupture in connection, real or perceived. Now, in a healthy context, those signals are useful. They guide us towards safety, reconciliation, growth. But in a narcissistic dynamic, those emotional responses are exploited. They become liabilities instead of tools. A narcissist doesn't want you regulated. They want you dysregulated, because that's when you're easiest to manipulate. That's when you're most pliable, most vulnerable to suggestion, most likely to seek their approval as a means to escape the discomfort they've deliberately triggered. It's psychological conditioning, operant Pavlovian. and it works as long as you remain unaware of the pattern. So what's the counter move? You don't argue. You don't match their chaos with your own. You don't prove your worth, plead your case, or fight for fairness in a rigged game. You learn to self-regulate in real time. You stay calm, not as a passive doormat, but as an active agent. You breathe when they expect you to panic. You pause when they want you to chase. You speak slowly when they bait you to escalate. You become, in effect, untouchable, not because you suppress emotion, but because you master it. There's a massive difference between suppression and regulation. Suppression is self-abandonment. It's pushing your feelings down to please others. Regulation, by contrast, is self-ownership. It's acknowledging your internal state without being dominated by it. It's the ability to witness your anger without lashing out, to notice your fear without running, to sit in your grief without collapsing. And in that moment, in that stillness, you return to power. Now, people misunderstand this power. They think calmness is weakness. They think if you're not reactive, you must not care. But that's only because they've been trained to equate chaos with passion, drama with depth, intensity with meaning. That's a distortion. Real strength is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of control. It's the ability to feel everything and still choose your behavior consciously. That's not repression, that's mastery. And let's be clear, this isn't easy, especially if you've been conditioned by trauma, especially if your nervous system is used to surviving, not thriving. Emotional regulation is not a switch you flip. It's a muscle you build. You train it every time you choose to pause, every time you breathe instead of break, every time you stay grounded in the face of provocation. It's slow, it's hard, but it's worth it. Because the reward is profound. You stop being a puppet. You become the puppeteer. And narcissists hate this. They hate it because they can't find the handle to control you anymore. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, selfish, and emotional. Why? Because they can't manipulate you through chaos, and that terrifies them. You've stopped being a source of narcissistic supply. You've become something they cannot understand, sovereign. What happens next is up to you. Emotional regulation doesn't mean you stay in the fire. It means you finally gain the clarity to walk out of it, not because you're numb, but because you've stopped playing their game. It means you become free, not just from them, but from the parts of yourself that were addicted to the roller coaster. That's the deeper liberation. Not just the absence of a narcissist, but the emergence of an integrated self. So here's the point. Master your emotion, or be mastered by those who know how to exploit them. The choice is yours. You can't always control what others do. But you can always control what you do with what they do. And that sacred pause between provocation and reaction, that's where your power lives. Protect it, cultivate it, choose it again and again until calm becomes your revolution. Let's talk about something that sounds simple but cuts to the very core of psychological warfare. Disengagement. See, when you're dealing with a narcissist or anyone who uses manipulation as a survival strategy, your attention is their oxygen. Your emotional energy, your reactions, your presence, even your silence, when it's laced with tension, all of it feeds them. And here's the critical realization. When you disengage, when you truly remove yourself psychologically and emotionally from the battlefield, you're not just ignoring them. You're shattering their illusion of control. Now, this isn't passive indifference. This is conscious detachment. There's a huge difference. Passive indifference is born of resignation. It's apathy, often accompanied by silent resentment or suppressed rage. But conscious detachment is entirely different. It's a philosophical stance. It's a psychological posture that says, I see you. I understand your pattern. And I will not participate. That decision, that shift in posture, is extraordinarily powerful because it upends the narcissist's entire relational framework. They're playing a game, and they need you to keep playing. They provoke to get a reaction. They withhold to make you chase. They flatter to gain trust, then criticize to destabilize. It's a push-pull dynamic engineered to keep you off balance and hyper-focused on them. It's not about love, it's about control. Disengaging breaks that spell. You stop dancing. You don't match their highs or respond to their lows. You become emotionally neutral. And that neutrality is infuriating to someone who survives on emotional drama. It denies them their favorite tool, your reactivity. And here's where people often get stuck. They think disengaging means being rude, shutting down, or cutting off all communication. But it doesn't have to look that way. In fact, the most effective form of disengagement is quiet inner clarity. You can still interact if necessary. You can be polite, even kind. But you are no longer invested. You are no longer negotiating your worth in that interaction. You're no longer seeking validation. You're simply present, but with your boundaries intact. It's the difference between being in a situation and being consumed by it. Now, the deeper reason this works so well, and why it's so hard to do, is because of what it asks from you. It asks you to stop needing the narcissist to be anything other than what they are. It asks you to stop hoping they'll change. Stop waiting for the apology. Stop craving justice or recognition or remorse. And that's tough, because part of you still wants the story to end differently. You want closure, you want fairness, you want someone who broke you to understand the damage they caused. But here's the hard truth. Closure is something you create. It's not something they'll ever give you. They're not built for that. Their self-image depends on the belief that they're always right, always justified. Expecting them to validate your pain is like asking a snake to grow legs. It's not going to happen. And the longer you wait, the more power you give them. Disengaging means reclaiming that power. Not by fighting, not by exposing them, not even by explaining yourself, but by leaving the arena altogether. That's what makes it so psychologically disruptive. The narcissist doesn't just lose a supply source, they lose an audience. An audience. And for someone whose identity is performative, that's devastating. This is especially true when the narcissist is a parent, partner, or someone deeply embedded in your life. Disengaging isn't always physical distance. Sometimes you still have to coexist. But even within proximity, you can create internal space. You can disengage from the emotional hooks. You can stop rising to the bait. You can meet the provocation with neutrality, not to punish, but to protect. This isn't coldness, it's wisdom. It's a refusal to bleed out for someone who doesn't bring you a bandage. It's the end of the illusion that your suffering will make them see the light. It won't. And the more you hope for that awakening, the more trapped you remain in a cycle of disappointment and despair. But when you choose disengagement, when you truly understand that it's not your job to fix, heal, or even confront someone who won't meet you in truth, then you take a massive step towards psychological freedom. You stop responding to every baited hook. You stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stop performing emotional labor in a rigged system. And in doing so, you finally make room for clarity, for healing, and for peace, because you're not here to be someone's emotional punching bag. You're not here to be a prop in someone else's performance. You're not here to teach someone how to love you while they're trying to control you. You're here to live, to breathe freely, to walk with your spine straight and your conscience clean. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. To simply turn inward, ground yourself, and exit the game they so desperately want you to keep playing. So remember this, when you disengage, you don't lose control. You don't abandon the fight, you rise above it. And in that still resolute silence, you become everything they fear most, untouchable. Let's talk about something that may seem deceptively simple, the act of not responding. Now, most people underestimate the psychological force behind silence. They think it's passive, that it signifies weakness or defeat. But in the context of narcissistic manipulation, silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. It's precision, it's restraint with purpose. And more often than not, it's the most powerful move on the board. You see, narcissists thrive on reaction. That's their currency. It doesn't even have to be a negative or positive response. It just has to be. Anger, frustration, tears, pleading, arguing, all of that is fuel. All of it tells them they still have a grip on your reality, that they still live rent-free in your mind, that they still matter to you. And if they matter, they win. Even if they're being hated, they win. Now imagine what happens when that reaction stops, when their words, once capable of unraveling you, fall flat, when their provocations are met with no emotional charge, when you don't even offer an explanation because they're no longer worth one. That right there creates a crisis in the narcissist world, because if you're no longer reacting, you're no longer controllable. And if they can't control you, they can't define you. They can't shape your identity in relation to their needs. And here's the key psychological insight. Silence isn't avoidance. It's a deliberate refusal to participate in a false reality. Narcissists don't want truth. They want distortion. They want to twist your words, rewrite your memories, bait you into defending yourself just so they can feel superior. They want to drag you into their emotional chaos so you forget who you are. When you respond, you're entering their arena. And that's a rigged game. The only winning move is to step off the stage. Now, that's not easy. Let's not pretend it is, especially if you're someone who values truth, resolution, clarity. If you've got a strong conscience, if you care about fairness, you're going to want to speak up. You're going to want to correct the lies, explain your intentions, set the record straight. But that instinct, noble as it might be, will be weaponized against you by a narcissist. They want you to keep engaging, because as long as you do, you're still in their orbit. So what does true non-response look like? It's not just biting your tongue. It's not suppression. It's a profound shift in psychological orientation. It's the moment you realize that no explanation, no confrontation, no logical argument will change a person who's invested in misunderstanding you. It's the internal decision that says, I don't owe you my energy. I don't owe you my peace. You withdraw your emotional availability, not out of spite, but out of wisdom. You stop broadcasting your pain to someone who's shown no capacity to handle it with care. You stop answering questions designed to manipulate. You stop feeding a system that thrives on your suffering. And silence doesn't always mean literal silence. Sometimes it's emotional silence. It's neutrality in your tone. It's choosing not to argue when they twist your words. It's choosing not to prove your worth to someone who can't see it. Huh? It's calm detachment in the face of chaos. And let me tell you, nothing confuses and unsettles a manipulator more than calm detachment. Because what they want is escalation. What they want is drama. What they want is drama. What they want is evidence that they still matter. When you don't give it to them, when you starve that part of the interaction, you're not just protecting yourself, you're showing them a mirror they can't bear to look into. Because silence in this context is the loudest truth. And it says everything that needs to be said without giving them anything to twist or use against you. And on a deeper philosophical level, silence is the assertion of sovereignty. It is the refusal to allow someone else to define the boundaries of your identity. When you respond, you're often trying to reclaim control, but ironically, in that very effort, you concede it. You let the other person set the terms of engagement. But when you don't respond, not out of fear, but out of strength, you're reclaiming your time, your space, your narrative. You're saying, I am not available for manipulation. I am not available for games. I am not available for distortion. I am only available for truth. And the truth is, some people will never meet you there, not because they can't, but because they won't. It doesn't serve their ego, doesn't preserve their illusion. So they push, they bait, they provoke. And your silence, that is the boundary, that is the shield, that is the sword. It's not easy. It will require every ounce of self-control and self-respect you've got. But the alternative, staying in the cycle, endlessly explaining yourself to someone who delights in your confusion, is soul death. And you deserve more than that. You deserve the peace that comes from knowing your truth, even if no one else affirms it. You deserve the strength that grows in quiet, unshakable clarity. You deserve a life where your energy is spent on building something meaningful, not surviving someone else's dysfunction. So when they come at you with distortion, with rage, with fake concern, with guilt trips or silent treatments of their own, you meet them with something more powerful than words. You meet them with stillness. Because sometimes the most powerful sentence you'll ever speak is the one you never say.